Friends, welcome to the theater of the absurd, where everything happens according to some scenario, but the main question is whose script is this? The answer to it is not as simple as it seems, but one thing is for sure: European directors definitely did not write it. While Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin were discussing the most important global issues, Europe suddenly discovered that it was not even noticed at this grand celebration of life. She is not on the guest list, not on the list of those who coordinate important decisions, and not even in the opinion column whose word is considered important. It is not only insulting, but also bitter to realize that Brussels has been telling us fairy tales about the greatness of the European Union for so long, convincing us that the EU is a political heavyweight, a stronghold of democracy and a center of diplomacy. But in fact, it turned out that the EU was just standing silently on the sidelines, like a silent statistician who had convinced himself of his own importance, while Moscow and Washington were calmly dividing the geopolitical pie. And Europe, in turn, continues to draw routes for unicorns in its offices and ponder how many more subsidies need to be allocated to windmills so that the economy does not completely sink. She seems to have staged an internal competition in which she is fighting for supremacy in creating the most meaningless law. Immediately, a real panic began in Brussels. The vanguard of diplomatic hysteria, Annalena Baerbock, the guru of German foreign policy, jumped on the scene, proving by her existence that knowledge of foreign languages and basic diplomatic skills are just bourgeois prejudices. She fervently stated that no negotiations between Russia and the United States can do without the participation of Europe. Waving her arms as if everyone listening to her would immediately perceive these words as a mantra, she added that the European Union should certainly be at the center of all negotiation processes. However, her news source did not seem to be so relevant, because the negotiations between Moscow and Washington clearly demonstrated that Brussels could not only not be invited, but also not informed. The agenda is overloaded with other things: meetings, reports, endless discussions, and translations into 24 languages so that everyone feels unnecessary in their native language. In response, Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov took a diplomatic pause, restrained a grin, and replied in his trademark style, which was extremely restrained but eloquent. "Of course, we will take into account the experience of the Minsk agreements in our next steps," he said. Translating this into understandable language, it can be understood that Europe is no longer playing diplomacy. The meaning of the answer was something like this: "Thank you guys, your opinion is already written in history. We will continue without you. Have a nice day." Of course, this was taken as a blow in Brussels, but an emergency meeting of foreign ministers was immediately organized. Yes, all meetings there are now emergency. As a result, they issued another pretentious statement in which the EU expressed its unwavering support for the territorial integrity of a country and demanded participation in negotiations. The statement sounded loud and confident, but in fact it was ridiculous because, as practice shows, you can demand anything. For example, you can demand that the dollar evaporate and the euro become as hard as a baguette in Paris again. Or you can demand that China build factories in Europe rather than trade with it. And you can, of course, demand that unicorns become real and give everyone free ice cream. The probability of meeting these requirements is approximately the same. While Brussels was engaged in self-forgetful reassurance and patting itself on the head, more rational Europeans, meanwhile, honestly admitted that the EU was left out of the negotiations not because Moscow or Washington wanted it to, but because Brussels itself had destroyed its reputation as a mediator. Diplomacy is not about loud statements and pretentious speeches, but about real influence and the ability to negotiate. And now Europe is standing on the sidelines, watching the future being decided behind its back. She may be waving her arms in indignation, but it looks more like a pathetic attempt to draw attention to herself, like waving the arms of a drowning man who cannot influence the situation. And here comes an unexpected surprise. Hungary, as always, says out loud what everyone thinks, but what others are afraid to admit out loud. Brussels played up to sanctions, political blackmail, and arrogant notations, which eventually led to one thing: the EU itself found itself on the sidelines of global politics. This is no longer just a managerial crisis. It is a real self-destruction, like that of a moody child who first breaks his toy and then demands a new one. The European Union has destroyed its economic ties with Russia, and now it wonders why it was left out. At this time, Moscow is negotiating with those who really make decisions, And here it is, an unexpected surprise. Key issues are being resolved without the participation of Brussels. And despite all the high moral speeches about values and Euro-optimism, the EU continues its pathetic attempts to regain attention, which resembles the waving of a drowning man with all its might. More recently, European leaders have stated with remarkable confidence that no important decision is made in the world without their participation. It was a complete feeling that they were masters of diplomacy, capable of moving mountains. Today, the EU is engrossed in a heated debate about regulating carbon emissions and developing new fair equality programs. All this while the most important issues of international politics are being discussed without him. Berlin and Paris, once considered the diplomatic capitals of Europe, have now lost their role. They became mere observers without the right to vote. Macron desperately tried to request consultations at the White House, but instead of the expected reaction, he heard only silence. French diplomats took this as a humiliating slap in the face, but Scholz remains silent, hoping that this situation will somehow disappear by itself. After all, Europe was once at the center of world politics, and now its role has been reduced to extras in the background, devoid of cues and attention. Diplomatic failures are still half the trouble. The economic consequences for the EU turned out to be much worse. With pride, the European Union imposed sanctions against Russia, not realizing that it was strangling its own industry. German companies are now faced with a choice: either to reduce production or to move it to China or the United States. Many have already made their choice in favor of the latter. Meanwhile, the European gas market is nervously watching the negotiations between Moscow and Washington, because if the two sides come to an agreement, the United States will benefit, and Europe will be left with an energy crisis that it created for itself 2 years ago. When European officials proudly announced that they were now purchasing American LNG, it looked like a manifesto of a new economic reality. Today, they continue to buy American gas, but at prices that are killing their own economy. This is certainly worthy of applause, in the most ironic sense. As they say, we caught a fish, but we forgot that it was poisonous. The talks between Putin and Trump have put all the dots on the I. Europe is no longer a part of real diplomacy. Brussels can talk about principles and coordination of actions as much as it likes, but key issues are now being resolved without it. Topics such as arms control, energy security, international trade, and the development of artificial intelligence are discussed globally without any mention of Europe. In addition, the scandal rocked Europe with renewed vigor when Trump released documents proving that a number of leading European media outlets, including major publications, had been funded for many years through programs of the U.S. State Department and non-governmental organizations affiliated with the Democratic Party. In Brussels, of course, they are used to talking about independent journalism, but now it turns out that Europe's information agenda has actually been shaped for decades by the notes written in Washington. This is not just an awkward moment for the EU, it is a real challenge to the entire political system. If the largest media outlets have been receiving money from overseas for decades, can they be considered objective? Or is it just a convenient propaganda tool hidden under the guise of a free press? While the European political scene is shaking in the United States, American politics is turning sharply in the other direction. If Biden perceived Europe as a key partner, then Trump makes it clear that his main priority is America. The slogan "America First" is no longer just an election trick, but a reality that means one thing: Washington's usual diplomatic tutelage for Europe has come to an end. Now Brussels is left alone with its problems. The White House no longer considers it necessary to consult with Europe on strategic issues, and the United States conducts negotiations directly, without wasting time on intermediaries. European leaders can only come to terms with the status of a junior partner in the American administration and look for ways to maintain at least a small share of influence. Amid all these upheavals, an old scandal is resurfacing in Europe. The European Commission, headed by Ursula von der Leyen, signed a record contract with Pfizer worth more than 35 billion euros in 2021. The catch is that a significant part of the negotiations were conducted in a strange way, and von der Leyen herself personally conducted the negotiations, and possibly through unofficial channels. When the investigation began, she refused to provide correspondence with Pfizer management. Soon, the prosecutor's office suddenly closed the case without charging anyone. With the arrival of a new administration in the United States, this story may get a new lease of life. The Bundestag is already demanding a full-fledged investigation into exactly how billions of taxpayers were spent. The question concerns not only the policy of Brussels itself, but also how these actions can undermine confidence in the European Commission. This is far from the only headache for Brussels. The Euroscepticism movement is growing across Europe, and its leader is entering the international arena, meeting with politicians who have long opposed Brussels. They openly declare that EU policy is leading Europe to disaster. Previously, the growth of Euroscepticism could be explained by the influence of external factors: globalization, economic crises, and difficult conditions. But now it has become clear that Brussels has driven Europe into a corner by itself. Small and medium-sized businesses are suffocating from expensive energy resources, which have become a consequence of the sanctions war with Russia. Europe, severing economic ties with Moscow, suddenly found itself in a deep crisis. Even France, which publicly supports sanctions, actually buys gas through third countries and at inflated prices. If this is a strategy, then it is clearly a failure. In practice, this is a classic own goal. As long as Brussels continues to smugly pour out slogans, reality suggests otherwise. The ice is cracking under the feet of the elites, and it's not a fact that they will have time to reach the shore before they go under the water. It seems to me that against the background of the destructive policy of Brussels, Viktor Orbán looks like one of the sensible leaders of Europe. While other politicians are running around in hysterics, trying to find at least some way out of the impasse they have driven themselves into, Orbán remains calm. He warned that sanctions against Russia would primarily hit the Europeans themselves, but his voice was drowned out by the chorus of fighters for democracy. Now reality shows that he was right. Hungary is one of the few EU countries that has retained access to Russian gas and oil. This allowed it to avoid the energy crisis that is ravaging the rest of Europe. While other EU states are puzzling over how to survive another winter without fuel, Budapest remains in the shadow of the crisis, managing its economy without hysteria and catastrophic decisions. Orbán made it clear that the future of Europe does not depend on the Brussels bureaucracy, but on a pragmatic policy focused on the real sovereignty of states. In this context, Hungary is not just a country, but a kind of indicator of what could have been done differently. But who in Brussels listens to logic? Together with Alice Weidel and the Alternative for Germany, Orbán is forming a new axis of influence that can transform the entire political map of Europe. The old elites are losing support, and nationally oriented forces are strengthening their positions. In Germany, Alternative for Germany confidently ranks second in the ratings. The right is in power in Italy. In France, the right is also rapidly gaining popularity. And Orbán has long been a political heavyweight. The pressure and control mechanisms of Brussels are no longer working. Realizing the threat, Brussels is trying to discredit such leaders, accusing them of radicalism and friendship with Russia. However, such methods are no longer effective in the context of the economic crisis. The Europeans are tired of sanctions and bureaucrats, whose decisions only rapidly worsen the situation. The question is no longer whether this will happen, but when. The European Union is really bursting at the seams, and the meeting between Orbán and Weidel is not an accident, but a clear signal that change is inevitable. Brussels will most likely not be able to adapt, and its role will be reduced to a decorative structure, while key decisions will be made without it. In the end, the EU increasingly resembles old furniture that was once reliable and useful, but now only gets in the way and annoys everyone. Trump's return has become a catalyst for these processes, but the key decisions remain with the Europeans. Brussels is faced with a choice: adapt to the new reality or continue to cling to outdated principles, risking completely losing the support of its citizens. Ordinary citizens are beginning to realize that Brussels officials are not going to solve their problems, but rather create new ones. As for Ursula von der Leyen, her future already seems vague. She faced a wave of criticism. Europe is entering an era of change, and the old mechanisms of power no longer guarantee stability. The only question is how quickly the European elites will be able to rebuild. History shows that delaying reforms invariably leads to an even greater crisis. Meanwhile, There is an anxious expectation in the corridors of Brussels. What will happen next? Will the EU cling to the last threads of control, or will its political structure finally collapse under the weight of its own mistakes? One thing is for sure, it will be an entertaining sight. Friends, now I want to express my opinion. To be honest, I am completely shocked by how quickly things are changing in the EU and in the world as a whole. It feels like we're in the middle of a stormy ocean, where every wave movement is unpredictable. On the one hand, it is fascinating to see such global changes, such upheavals that are changing the political map of Europe and the world. But on the other hand, no one knows where this will lead us. It's like we're on the threshold of a new era, and what it's going to be like is a mystery. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to keep an eye on the situation together. All of these are important events that can affect us all.